I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his presentation. I now invite the next participating delegation, Indonesia, to make its oral statement before the court. And I call upon His Excellency Habas Ogreseno to take the floor.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, honorable judges of the court, I have the utmost honor and privileges today to deliver submissions on behalf of the Republic of Indonesia on the request for an advisory opinion of this court concerning the obligations of states in respect of climate change. Climate change stood as one of the greatest environmental challenges to humankind. It is recognized as one of the most complex, multifaceted, and urgent threats. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Climate resilient development integrates adaptations and mitigations to advance sustainable development for all and is enabled by increased international cooperations, including improved access to adequate financial resources, particularly for vulnerable regions, sectors and groups, as well as inclusive governance and coordinated policies. To address the adverse impact of climate change, countries agreed to take efforts individually and collectively to take necessary adaptation and mitigation measures, guided by the principles that are enshrined in Rio Declarations on Environment and Development 1982 and the Paris Agreement 2015. I wish to go through these instruments and also other instruments such as United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea 1982 and those of human rights nature, taking into account Indonesia's perspective of their role in stipulating states' obligations regarding climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and what those obligations entail for state and community of states. Mr. President, honorable judges of the court, the Rio Declarations, as we are all aware of, plays a pivotal role in the establishment of the global governance on environment. Principle 7 of the Rio Declarations clearly underline the importance for global partnerships in protecting and restoring the Earth ecosystems, highlighting the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities of countries in light of their different level of development as well as their level of emissions. Not long after the Rio Declarations was agreed upon, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea 1982 entered into force in 1994. While UNCLOS does not specifically mention climate change, nor the effect of greenhouse gas emission in the marine environment, Article 192 imposes general obligations on states to protect and to preserve the marine environment. These provisions encompasses all forms of marine environmental harm, including those resulting from anthropogenic activities such as greenhouse gas emissions. Building on Article 192, other provisions within Part 12 elaborate specific duties that contextualize this obligation in the face of contemporary challenges, including climate change. For example, Article 194.1 requires states to take all measures consistent with these conventions that are necessary to prevent, reduce, and control pollutions of the marine environment from any source. Clearly, the negotiator of UNCLOS had long visions on the condition of the environment of our oceans from various sources of pollutions. It is also pertinent to consider international climate change agreements complementing the obligations under UNCLOS. Article 4 of the UNFCCC underscored the commitment of all parties to promote, cooperate in the development, applications, and diffusions, including transfer of technologies, practices, and processes to control, reduce, or prevent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases in all relevant sectors. This commitment directly supports the objectives of marine environmental protections under the UNCLOS by addressing land and atmosphere-based sources of pollutions that ultimately affect the marine environment. Furthermore, it is important to also take into account the recent advisory opinion on climate change and international law by International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, ITLOS. The tribunal explored states' obligation under a number of UNCLOS articles. On Article 192, the tribunal states that it imposes a general obligation on state parties to protect and preserve the marine environment and can be invoked to combat any form of degradations of the marine environment, including climate change impacts. In relation to Article 194, Paragraph 1, while it does not mention greenhouse gas emissions, the tribunal noted that the compound objective should be understood in the context of the comprehensive nature of the obligations, and thus interpreted that this paragraph also covers anthropogenic emissions. ITLOS stipulated that state parties measured to prevent, reduce, and control the marine environment from anthropogenic emissions should be determined objectively. The scope and necessary measures may vary in accordance with the means available to state parties and their capabilities. As the largest archipelagic state in the world, with more than 17,000 islands, Indonesia is not immune to the multidimensional impact and existential threats of climate change. On the contrary, it brings particular challenge to the coastal environment and communities. They are vulnerable to one of several impacts of climate change, the sea level rise. Data compiled at national level shows that Indonesia experiences about 4 to 7.6 millimeters increase of sea level rise since 1992. The rising sea level threatens to flood many coastal and low-lying areas of Indonesia, both in large islands as well as in small and outermost islands. Such areas have experienced damages to the infrastructure, disruptions of livelihood and economic activities, as well as displacement of millions of peoples. Currently, the main instrument for states to protect the climate system from greenhouse gas emission is the Paris Agreement. While the Paris Agreement has referred the word ocean, the last part of our planet, in only once in just one paragraph, it stipulates obligations for states to take major efforts through their NDCs to address the effect of climate change. The Paris Agreement sets temperature targets in Article 2 and outlines objectives to enhance climate resilience. To achieve these goals, Article 4 obligates parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain NDCs reflecting their highest ambitions. To align with these objectives, Indonesia has taken various steps, including decreasing fossil fuel consumptions, transitioning to clean energy, to the net zero emission roadmap 2060, to reduce marine plastic debris by 70% in 2025, and implemented a moratorium on new permits for clearing forest areas and peatlands, which contributed to a decrease in deforestation. Indonesia has managed to reduce deforestation by 75% and re-wet more than 800,000 hectares of peatland and restore over 2 million hectares of peatland. Mitigation and adaptation measures require substantial financial resources, and the Paris Agreement highlights the need for developed countries to take the lead by providing financial support, transferring environmentally sound technologies, and building capacity in developing nations. Article 6, 9, 10, and 11 create the space for countries like Indonesia to tailor their policies while relying on international cooperations to address resource and capacity gaps. Thus, while universal in scope, the agreement enables diverse strategies to achieve shared climate goals. However, while Paris Agreement is legally binding, financial commitments, technology transfer, and capacity building often fall short, undermining the ability of developing nations to meet their climate objectives. The rhetoric of highly ambitious climate actions collapses, as illustrated in many negotiations in any multilateral environmental matters when it comes to mobilizing finance. The recently concluded COP29 in Baku, while indeed concluded with a deal of $300 billion annually, did fall short from the requests of the states most affected by the impacts of climate change. To provide some perspective on the magnitude of financial requirement to mitigate and adapt to climate change, Indonesia alone, we require $281 billion from 2015 to 2030 to address climate change challenges. Our national budget can only cover 18% of such financial requirements. This means that we need external financing on climate change challenges. Mr. President, honorable judges of the court, the point of climate finance obligation is to provide states with less capabilities with resources needed to implement their obligations in protecting the environment. That is the context that Indonesia wishes to elaborate, and not in regard to reparations. The latter point requires a court to establish that a clear violation has occurred under certain international provisions, assess the harm to enable it to come to a decision. That is not a course of action that we pursue here through this process, particularly noting that the Paris Agreement does not include any clause of article on liability if a state fails to reach its indices. This further underlines the notion that the agreement confers its state party obligation of conduct, not obligation of results. In relation to compliance to stipulated obligations, the agreement followed previous multilateral environmental agreements, which established non-punitive mechanisms for monitoring, assessing, and providing recommendations for states to facilitate better compliance and enhance implementation. Instead, the Paris Agreement encourages international cooperation to support countries, especially the developing countries, to reach their climate goals. Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, let me turn to human rights instruments such as the International Covenant on the Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our perspective on the relations between these instruments, many of which Indonesia is state party to, and environmental law with climate change or environmental declarations are indirect. Study group of ILC 2006 revealed that where one impact of globalizations is the increasing fragmentations in the sphere of social action and structure, which is accompanied by the emergence of specialized and autonomous rules, legal institutions, and sphere of legal practices such as environmental law, law of the sea, human rights law, and other specialist systems with their own principles and institutions. It further views that the interaction between two or more different bodies of law may create the danger of conflicting and incompatible rules, principles, rule system, institutional practices that might undermine their effective implementations. Thus, in relation to the current request of advisory opinion, say from the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which mentioned that parties should, when taking into action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligation on human rights, right to health, and the rights of different groups, the convergence of obligation under human rights law, and particular obligation under environmental law has not been firmly articulated in the existing relevant treaties. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as foundational document, laid the groundwork for the recognition of individuals, which are further elaborated by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Neither instrument specifically addresses the environment or climate change. Despite this, it is worth noting that discussion on environmental issues by different international bodies or actors through the resolutions, general comments of UN treaty bodies, scientific reports, publications, joint statements, suggest the emerging recognitions of the linkage between human rights and protection of the environment in a generic matter. Nevertheless, the non-legally binding nature of those decisions and resolutions is well defined in international law. Thus, while the corpus of international human rights law does not create specific obligations relating to the protection of climate system or parts of the environment from anthropogenic emission of greenhouse gases, there is a general recognition of the connections between environmental protection and human rights. In this context, states' obligations and their implementations relating to the climate system within the framework of human rights, if it exists, should only be limited to their own population within their territories. At national level, in our case, Indonesian constitutions, in specifically Article 28H, and Indonesian law and environmental protections of 2009, specifically Article 65, stated that all people have the right to a good health and healthy environment as part of their human rights. Article 2 of the law states the protection and management of environment is carried out on the basis of principle of state's responsibility. Thus, Indonesia, in its domestic legal instruments, do recognize healthy environment as human rights. However, in our jurisprudence, numerous environmental cases involving both government and corporation, courts have ruled that unlawful acts were committed, requiring responsible parties to compensate for material and non-material damages resulting from environmental harm, but these cases often address issues such as deforestation, pollution, and other forms of environmental degradations. And while the rulings frequently mandate remedies for ecological and economic harm, they so far did not recognize violations of environmental laws in Indonesia as a violations of human rights. As Indonesia stated in its written statement, that in order to render the advisory opinion as requested, it is important that the court would elaborate within the ambit of the existing international legal framework, which directly governs the issue of climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. Strict application of legal rules will help facilitate clarity and comprehension in the climate change deliberations, and especially mitigation and adaptation efforts globally. Against these backgrounds, Indonesia offers the following points. A, that the implementation of various environmental obligations requires effective cooperation within states and within relevant organizations based on the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability in light of different national circumstances, taking into account the level of development, geographical circumstances within states, and particular attention to least developed states and vulnerable countries, as well as archipelagic states, noting their particular susceptibility to the repercussions of rising sea level. B, that states have an obligation to take climate action and contribute to the global response to climate change in line with the respective NDC and the best available science, and also responsibility of developed states to take the lead in reducing emissions and supporting the developing countries through financial contributions, technology transfer, and capacity building. That under existing human rights treaties, there are no particular obligation for states to ensure the protection of the climate system. This position is taken with cognizance of an emerging political recognition of the linkages between environmental protection and human rights. And while noting the attempt to develop a new human rights instrument to a decent and healthy environment, the fact of the matter is that such human rights instrument is not yet discussed or planned to be discussed in any multilateral settings. In line with the existing international legal framework, particularly the Paris Agreement 2015, Indonesia urged developed countries to fulfill their existing obligations in assisting developing countries with respect to both mitigation and adaptation by providing financial resources. Mr. President, honorable members of the courts, Indonesia believes that the opinion of the court will serve as a meaningful guidance for many stakeholders to interpret international law on climate change. It will also influence the future political deliberations to shape the next global climate change governance. To conclude, it is our fervent hope that the information and observations furnished by Indonesia in its written statement and again today in these oral proceedings will be of assistance to the court. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his presentation. This concludes this afternoon's sitting. The oral proceedings will resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. in order for Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Kenya, Kiribati, and Kuwait to be heard on the questions submitted to the court. The sitting is closed.